Well, good afternoon. My name is Umi Hankins, and I'm the senior consultant for UJIMA, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black Community. And today we are proud and honored to host the second of a series of webinars that UJIMA has started to do. UJIMA is dedicated to ensuring that we're educating the community, advocates, funders, everyone, social workers, educators, that we're educating everyone and making them more aware of the issue of violence against women in the Black community. So we appreciate the fact that you're joining us today. As I said, this is our second webinar, and we have 3 honored guests that will be with us. One of our guests, and I'll give you their names, and they will briefly introduce themselves in a moment, but we have Dr. Keisha. If you look at your screen, we have Dr. Keisha Ross. She will be with us. We also have Dr. Callie Nicole Gross, who is joining us. And then last of all, we have Dr. Dinah Rainey Bering. And I stopped for a moment because I don't see Dinah's picture on our, oh, there you are. Okay, I had lost you for a minute, Dinah, sorry about that. We also have Dr. Dinah Rainey Bering. And so those are going to be our 3 presenters. As I said, they'll introduce themselves in a moment, but just want to do a little setup for you. You'll notice that in addition to our speakers, we also have a sign interpreter, and that was by request, and we hope that we're able to clearly make our systems accessible to everyone. So we will have 2 sign interpreters. One is Elijah, who will be joining us, Elijah Lockhart, and the other is Edward Knight, and they will, as I said, both be joining us today. In addition, we have a Spanish interpreter. She's not on the screen, but is connected with our individual who needed interpretation services in Spanish. All right. So first of all, we have at the bottom, you will be able to see that we have people joining us. We will want to have any questions and answers that you may have. At the bottom of the screen, we have a place where you can ask questions and type them in. It says Q&A. So if you look at the very bottom of your screen, you'll see Q&A, and you'll be able to type in any questions that you'll have, and we'll refer to them and make sure that we get them addressed as well. The title of our webinar today is The Impact and Treatment of PTSD for Black Women Experiencing Violence. So we're including intimate partner violence and domestic violence in the realm of intimate partner violence, sexual assault, and other forms of violence that may have been experienced historically and through the current date of where we are as a Black community. So introducing themselves, first of all, we'll go around and I'll have them introduce themselves in the order of their presentations. And so we have Dr. Rainey Bering. Would you please introduce yourself briefly?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I am the Oliver H. Radke Regents Professor of History and the Associate Dean of the Graduate School at the University of Texas at Austin. My research is on gender and slavery and the Black woman's experience in the United States. And I'm happy to be a part of this conversation.
And thank you very much, Dr. Rainey Bering. And then following her, we will also have Dr. Callie Nicole Gross. And would you introduce yourself?
Yes, good afternoon. Thanks very much for having me. My name is Callie Nicole Gross. I am the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of History at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. My research explores the historical experiences of Black women in the country's criminal justice system in the late 19th or early 20th centuries.
Thank you very much as well. And I'm not sure, did I say Callie? Sometimes I pronounce your name wrong, so I want to make sure.
Callie, first time is wrong, second time is right.
Very good, thank you. Sorry about that.
No worries.
And then our last speaker who will be joining us today is Dr. Keisha Ross. Would you please?
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm also looking forward to the dialogue. I am a full-time clinical psychologist at the St. Louis Veterans Administration, where I conduct group individual therapy, as well as I work on quality improvement grant research for working with veterans of color, as well as I conduct minority stress resilience group to assist in coping with race-based stress.
Very good. Thank you also for joining us today. So in getting involved in this discussion, many times it has come up about the issue of historical trauma. And we looked at a way of saying that there's this severe impact that our history has had on our communities today. And I think that it's necessary that we began to look at this and began to understand what is the connection between our history, historical trauma, and the way in which we engage with systems today, the way in which we are able to respond to crimes such as domestic violence and sexual assault that happen in our community today. And so what we hope to do is to make sure that there's this connection, that it's not lost with our color of our skin, our self-identity, and issues of racism and systemic racism that has existed for centuries, and then how that impacts the way in which we're able to respond to violence in our lives and how we're able to heal from detrimental effects that have happened in our lives as well. So Dr. Rainey Bering, could you please start us off and give us an overview of some of the things, the ways in which our history has impacted the Black community?
Sure. So can I put my slides up? Are they showing?
Yes,
Great.
they are.
Okay, great. So I wanted to start off with just giving you all a brief sort of overview in history, beginning with enslavement and trauma. And one of the things that I like to do in my classes at UT Austin is that I start off by reminding people that African people were free before they were enslaved. And that seems like a very simple sort of statement, but I don't like to talk about the history of the United States and starting off as Africans and African Americans as being enslaved, because they were free before they were pulled into captivity. And in order for us to understand the trauma that was experienced and the trauma that sort of lingers today, we have to understand the foundations of that. So to think about, I always ask people to imagine, your everyday life, being in a particular village, maybe, working at home in your community, and being pulled and uprooted by people that you don't recognize, that you've never seen, and taken on, a journey to places that you've never witnessed. The journey may take 300 miles. It may cross terrain and land that you've never ever seen before. You may then get to a space that's the side of a body of water that doesn't have an end to it. And that body of water is something that you've never seen that wide. When we look at the experience of captivity of African people when they were first free, as I mentioned, living in their respective towns and villages and cities, this was just a general overview of how some of them experienced what became the Middle Passage. And I always talk about that beginning in their homelands and in their villages, not just on the ships. So there's a lot of trauma that's been experienced before they're even loaded onto the ships. And that's an experience that we've talked about, and we have a number of books that cover that history. So I want to also just remind the viewers that some of the images that I'm going to show are a little bit graphic, and I don't always give trigger warnings because I feel like Africans weren't given a trigger warning when they were captured, but I wanted to be respectful of the community that I'm speaking to today and just let you know that some of these images might be disturbing to some of you. So once Africans reached the coastline, and that journey sometimes took almost 300 miles. It could have been across a 300-mile terrain. Sometimes mountainous, sometimes rainforests, sometimes deserts, depending on where they were captured from. Then they were then put in holding facilities along the coastline, the West African coastline. And this was a 3,500-mile coastline of where people were captured and put in what we call fortifications. You might see the term barracoons, or castles is another term that's not necessarily politically correct today, but they were put in these fortifications along the coastline. And sometimes after having traveled 200 or 300 miles, the trauma that they're experienced along that journey, trying to make sense and understand the separation from their family, around people who don't speak the same language as them, who culturally dress and look differently from them, and then put in a holding facility similar to a jail or a prison for as long as 8 or 9 months, and you're still trying to understand what's happening. This is something that happened to those before they were put on ships. I'm gonna have to mute for a second because there's an airplane going over.
Yes, and Dr. Rainey Bering did tell us that where she is right now is close to an airport. And so occasionally she has an airplane that flies by or a background noise that she may hear. And so she will mute briefly. So she'll be right back with us.
I'm back. Thank you so much. So in these holding facilities, imagine trying to make sense of what's happened and what's going to happen. Imagine trying to make sense of the separation that one has experienced. Then they're placed on small boats to take them out to larger ships at sea. And the journey and the trauma at sea is a burden that we carry as a culture and as a people that has lasted. The journey took as long as 12 weeks initially, and as short as 6 or 8 weeks once they figured out navigation routes, and they made improvements to the ships. But the Middle Passage is a part of this experience that was extremely traumatic for those of African descent. To be placed in suffocating bellies of slave ships, to then be brought up aboard the ship, to be tortured like this image of a woman hanging by her ankles, to also have to deal with physical and sexual assault by the captain and the crew. Some of them were selected at times to be the pleasures, to give pleasure to the men on the ships. Some women were also pregnant when they were captured, and some of them were impregnated on the ships. And so we also know, we have a little bit of evidence of women giving birth in the bellies of slave ships. So some of the births that they were given could have been from sexual trauma that they experienced along the way before they were put on the ship. It could have been sexual trauma they experienced from the fortifications along the West African coastline. But this is something that happened in a space that was not a healthy environment. There was all kinds of sickness, disease, hunger, and as I mentioned, exploitation and pregnancy. You also have enslaved women or captive women now who are trying to find a way to make sense of what their experience, and some of them choose to, if they have the opportunity, to jump overboard and to take their own lives, and to transition to a space and a place that they believe will free them. So this is a space of trauma that many of you probably know this or heard this, but people talk about the Atlantic Ocean being a large graveyard of African peoples. The bodies of African peoples lie on the belly and the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. And that's a trauma, and that's evidence of that trauma, right? That's evidence of this that still stays there. Some enslaved people or captive people were murdered and put to death and hung or whipped or punished. Some of them their lives were taken because the crew knew that they wouldn't make it to the other side. They wouldn't make it to then be sold into enslavement. So some of them were taken, they either shot them or they threw them overboard. So this is a space, the trauma at sea, the terror at sea. A number of scholars have written about this. I'm happy to share other scholarship, particularly those books and articles written by Black women who've written about this experience, who have really worked hard to focus on what this experience might have been like for African women and that were in the Middle Passage. Moving on, one of the aspects when we look at slavery, once they arrive to the Caribbean plantations, the plantations and the communities in the West Indies, and also in what becomes the United States, they're taken off ships, and there's about 6 to 7 years of recovery if they last that long to survive the Middle Passage, to get their strength back, to learn about their routine, their new routine as enslaved people. So they were once free, they were captured, they went through an experience of captivity, and then they were brought to New World plantation communities in Brazil and other parts of South America, the West Indies, British, Guyana, French, all parts of the Caribbean, and then into the United States, what becomes the United States. And one of the things that I try to focus on in my own work is that, looking at the experience from enslaved people and from their voices and what they say. So what did Black women say about enslavement? We have lots of testimony and evidence from their experiences where we can learn firsthand. We can understand how they developed coping mechanisms to deal with the day-to-day trauma that they experienced. We understand who they turned to for support and what happened when the courts were involved. Some of them went to the court looking for protections. Some of them were taken to court and then given punishments. And then also just to think about, I'll say a few more things about what historians have uncovered and where we are in the scholarship on slavery today, because we've made a significant ground. The first books that were published on this history were published in the 1918 was the first book on American Negro slavery. But it wasn't really until 1985 that Black women scholars, Deborah Gray White in particular, published the first book, Aren't I a Woman?, on enslaved women. And then there were a number of scholars that published on the Caribbean experience, like Sir Hilary Beckles, published on women in Barbados. And there's a number of other Afro-Caribbean women who have published work on women in slavery. So that literature is very important because they're asking the kinds of questions that other scholars, or mainstream scholars, traditional scholars, white scholars have often overlooked and ignored. So it's much different kinds of questions that are being answered. So what did Black women say about slavery? One of the things they talked about was Harriet Jacobs reminds us that she says that slavery was terrible. Slavery was a terrible experience, but it was more terrible for women. And she's arguing that because she's talking about how women experience sexual abuse. We've recently learned that enslaved men have also experienced sexual abuse and trauma. And that's something that scholars are talking about now when we look at issues of gender and slavery. But how did they cope? Some women, some mothers and aunties and grandmothers taught their daughters to protect their principles. That's the term they use, protect your principle, don't let nobody bother your principle. Fight if you can't fight, kick if you can't kick, scream. If you can't scream, scratch. So they're teaching their daughters and passing down stories where women overcame sexual abuse, physical abuse. Harriet Jacobs' narrative, An Incident in the Life of a Slave Girl, tells stories about how women and young girls dreaded their pubic years when they go through puberty. They dreaded that time period. Some of them didn't want to be considered pretty because they knew that meant physical and sexual abuse. Jacobs talks about how her enslaver whispered vile things in her ears, and it's just this is a level of trauma, psychological trauma, even before they experienced the physical or sexual, that enslaved women had to cope with and deal with. And they turned to their loved ones and their family members for support. This is an image of Harriet Jacobs, and this is one of the few images that we have of her. One of the stories that's famous that Deborah Gray White writes about, and also Tom Foster, who writes about the Rethinking Rufus, looking at enslaved men and sexual abuse, is a story of an enslaved woman from Texas named Rose Williams. She was put in a cabin and was told to have sex with this enslaved man named Rufus, because during the 19th century, after the closing of the transatlantic slave trade, women's bodies were very much valued because they wanted women to produce more sources of labor, i.e. enslaved children, so that enslavers did not have to purchase enslaved people. So they were actually forcing breeding, rape, and encouraging forms of reproduction among enslaved women. I refer to this as rape, although Dr. Gross will talk about this shortly about issues of rape among enslaved women. But I would argue that a lot of the enslaved girls in the stories that we know of, some of the famous young girls like Sally Hemings, they were having sex or forced to have sex with men that were sometimes 25, 30 years their senior. And a lot of these young girls today, this would be considered statutory rape because they were underage. And that was not considered for enslaved women, because during slavery, they were considered property and people could do what they wished with their property. So Rose Williams, the story is important because she resists Rufus. She doesn't want to have sex with him. And she's threatened by her owner, constantly threatened, and eventually gives in and says that she gives birth to a number of children by him. She's not proud of it. Here comes the airplane. She's not proud of it.
We can't hear the plane.
Oh, good. Okay. She's not proud of the experience, and she never marries, but she says that she finally gave in because of the punishment and the trauma that she was experiencing on a day-to-day basis from her enslaver. Other enslaved people were literally locked in cabins and told that they had to stay in there, these quote unquote couples, and I'm saying this with scare quotes because that might not be the partner they chose to be with. They were told that they could come out once they showed signs of physical pregnancy. And we all know some women don't show for 4 or 5 months, depending on their body structure, their physique and all that. So these women sometimes were getting 20 or 30 lashes a day until they showed signs of pregnancy. This is trauma that is going to carry over. Finally, I want to just say 2 other stories. One about Celia, who Dr. Gross will also mention briefly, but Celia was a young girl who in 1854 was purchased. I think she was 12 or 13 years of age. And on the way back from the auction block, Robert Newsom, her enslaver, raped her literally before they even reached the plantation that he was taking her to. He raped her constantly. She ended up having 2 children by him. And that's another area that I think needs to get addressed. Is like, what does it mean to raise the children that were conceived out of rape or trauma? That's a very difficult space that maybe Dr. Ross can address a little bit later. At any rate, Celia's living on this farm with Newsom. She's one of the only enslaved women there. She's trying to fight off of his daily sexual abuse. He tells her he's coming to see her again. She has her 2 little ones that she's given birth to from her enslaver. And she says, I don't want you to come to the cabin tonight. He comes to the cabin anyway, and she says, listen, I really don't want to do this tonight. And he comes towards her, and she hits him over the head with a club 2 times and kills him. And then puts his body in the fireplace and burns him and hides his remains throughout the plantation. She then they discover the bones later on, and she gets taken to trial. But they hold off on, she's considered guilty. They hold off on her hanging because she's pregnant, and they wanted to wait to see if she gives birth before they hung her. So still, there's a story about it. There's a scholar out of Johns Hopkins, Martha Jones, is doing work called the Celia Project. I recommend people to look that up online. They're doing a lot of research on this particular case and trying to understand other cases of enslaved women and the way they try to fight against different forms of trauma. So I think it's important for us to understand that, Black people in general, when we look at the history of slavery and we look at Black women in particular, have tried to resist. And I always argue that they resisted from the moment of captivity until the moment of death for them. Ellen Craft is an image I have here on screen. She's an African-American woman who could pass for white. So she cross-dressed as a white male enslaver. She put her arm in a sling, and she put not this picture doesn't have it, but she covered her mouth with a cloth to show that she had broken her jaw, or pretended like she broke her jaw. And her husband traveled with her as her servant. So she pretended that she was a white male enslaver, and her husband was her body servant. And they traveled 1,000 miles from Georgia, and they made it into freedom. And they didn't want to have children until they were free. They then wrote a book about it called Running 1,000 Miles to Freedom. And they spent some time in Europe, and they spent time on the anti-slavery tour. And they came back after slavery was over and raised their children back in Georgia and opened up schools for free Blacks. So this is just, a response to the trauma of slavery and an act of resistance and survival. Lear Green is another young woman that people may or may not have heard of, but she shipped herself to freedom. She put herself in a box.
It's okay.
She put herself in a box, and for 18 hours was in a trunk, like a sailor's trunk. And she shipped herself to freedom. Her soon-to-be mother-in-law, the man that she wanted to marry was a free African-American man. So the mother-in-law, her mother-in-law, who she married late into the family after they became free, traveled with her. And she almost was caught on several times while they were on steamers. And she made it to freedom and was able to tell her story to a major abolitionist, William Still. So this is another example of putting herself in a space that probably was traumatic for her. And she knew it was life-threatening, but she was willing to do that in order to become free. There's a number of other women that I could mention, but I wanted to just mention their names briefly so that we have time to hear from the other speakers. But Mariah Stewart chose to fight against slavery verbally, and she was the first woman to speak publicly, white or black, to large audiences in the 1830s. And she was an abolitionist and a women's rights activist, and many of us would consider her a feminist. But she spoke truth to power about the history of slavery and about activism and about ways in which to fight and end the institution. Elizabeth Keckley was another woman who was a seamstress in the White House, but she tells her story about how she survived slavery, and she used her skill and craft as a way to make a better space for her while she was still enslaved. And one of the persons that Dr. Gross and I write about in our forthcoming book, A Black Woman's History of the United States, we open up with a woman by the name of Isabel de Olvera, who was a woman of African and Indian descent who left Mexico and asked in 1600 to go on an expedition to help discover present-day New Mexico. So here's a woman of African descent who was willing to risk her life to travel from Mexico into what becomes New Mexico at a time when it was very dangerous. And she goes to the court and she says that, I am neither bound by marriage or slavery, and I demand justice. So we have Black women entering the United States demanding justice, and I would argue that we're still demanding justice today. And one of the things that us historians are trying to do is to have a full cost accounting of the experience of Black women in America, Black women from their freedom in Africa up until their captivity in the United States, and then their freedom again in 1865, and understanding how they valued their souls and how they found ways to survive, how they turned internally and fought against trauma. I argue that they had a value that nobody could commodify, and that was the value of their soul. And that value was infinite, and that value was something that they clung on to. And they expressed their soul values in ways that we might call resistance, in ways that we might, when they committed suicide, that might have been their way to express, like, I'm gonna choose when I die and how I die. But Black women have always been demanding justice and always been fighting for and fighting against the trauma that they've experienced. So thank you for listening. I look forward to the questions that we have in the next phase, and please feel free to reach out to me through my website or through Twitter or my internet. And also, this is the cover of the book that Dr. Gross and I have just completed, A Black Woman's History of the United States. A lot of the stories that I've shared with you are covered in this book. It's written for a large audience, and we hope that this will educate people to understand the historical foundations of the ways in which Black women have survived trauma. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation and for all of that information. Just incredible, absolutely incredible. When you first started your presentation, Dr. Rainey Bering, you had mentioned about the images that we were going to see of Black women as we looked at this. Can I get some reaction from the other presenters that are there as to, how do we feel about that? I mean, our history has been just for so long hidden from us, not visible and not giving voice to what has happened to us. And so is it necessary that we show, or why is it necessary that we portray these images of Black women and their experience during this period of time?
So I think it's very important, certainly, to show the images. It's a part of our history and our experience. And so it's critically necessary. But that said, I also think that it is important to do so responsibly. I think one of the things that Dr. Bering and I, and many of the scholars who do work on Black women, try to do is to not shy away from the violence or some of the ugly aspects of our history, but to do it but to convey it in a way within a context and to sort of demonstrate a point, not to just sort of be gratuitous, and to further sort of exploit Black women or their images.
Thank you. Keisha, anything you want to add to that?
I agree that it is necessary. As a clinical psychologist, I understand that, we can't have healing if we don't confront these truths. And unfortunately, there's been a great deal of miseducation about our history. So I appreciate that it was there, and it is in a respectful way. I understand working with individuals who have histories of trauma. Sometimes it may be activating or a trigger. However, having the warning, it appropriately helps to prepare people for that. But when I do my trainings, I agree that, with Dr. Rainey Bering, there was no warning for Africans who were free, that they were going to be captured. So I totally do understand that, and sometimes it's important for the audience to understand that as well.
Yeah, and when I actually saw those images, it made me think about my daughter Lauren Collins, who graduated from Howard University, but when she was there some years ago. But when she was there, she had an opportunity to work on the New York burial ground project, where Howard was in charge of respectfully having custody of the remains of all of the enslaved individuals that were buried there. And Lauren had an opportunity to help by identifying the bones, identifying what really happened to the individual. She's a physical therapist, and as part of her anatomy class, she was able to do this. And so she said to me that it was sad, but it also was healing for her. While it was sad, it gave her the opportunity to understand the truth of what happened, to be able to see it demonstrated in our bodies, and as a physical therapist, to really see the way in which that had an impact on the bodies that individuals who had gone through such traumatic events, and what physical ailments took place as a result of that. So it was healing for her to be able to see it while it was sad and remorseful. So I think as we talk about these things, because we do talk about sexual assault, we do talk very graphically about domestic violence issues, and we want to make sure that if someone needs to have care, that you get that care, that you make sure and take care of yourself. But what we're just trying to do is to demonstrate, to educate, to make sure there's a clear awareness, to give voice to the history that has gone before us. So that, is a great lead-in for you, Dr. Gross. Can you then share some information about leading from the enslavement period to the post-slavery period and what went on in the Black community?
Right, thanks. So I'm gonna try to jump right in, and I'll start a little bit differently. One of the things that led me to the topic in exploring sort of these legal legacies of sort of racism and sexual violence in Black women's history has to do with an experience that I had as a graduate student. Some sisters and I organized and actually volunteered to teach a course in a women's prison. We were teaching a course on African-American women's history. And so we knew that Black women would be in the class, but what we weren't prepared for was how starkly overrepresented Black women actually were in the institution. So at that time, this was in the mid-90s, 1990s, I was astonished at how disproportionately represented Black women were. We'd heard a lot about the experience of Black men in the carceral state. I just had no idea about the experience of Black women. And the more that I learned about their experiences inside, a number of things became apparent. There are a number of women there who were victims of domestic violence, intimate partner violence. A lot of times they were criminalized for self-defense. A shocking number of the women had histories of sexual violence and trauma beginning in their childhoods. So the historian in me, of course, wanted to know sort of more about how long Black women had actually been in this institution, and just more about kind of these sorts of legacies. And so one of the things that I found was that there's sort of a number of ways in which Black women are especially vulnerable in the US, and I think throughout the diaspora. It has sort of a legal codification, and then also a component that is kind of a social or cultural sort of codification around what it means to be a Black woman in America from a mainstream vantage point comes into being. And so just as Dr. Berry, I think brilliantly told us that the first Africans that reach the shores are not actually enslaved, right? Many of them are some of them are freed, some of them are explorers, like Isabel de Oliveira. Some of them, though, end up becoming indentured servants, which is where they end up sort of working for a period of time. And then after their term of indenture, you know, presumably they're free, they get a parcel of land and clothes. This is similar to the experience of many poor and working class Europeans that also end up coming to the country. And so it's not really, and so in the earlier periods where you have sort of Africans beginning to show up, many of them are indentured. We don't really sort of see legislation that codifies lifelong enslavement. At least some of the early legislations in 1640, the case of John Punch. John Punch was an indentured African who actually runs away with two other indentured servants who were European. They get caught, and while the others experience, you know, the typical punishment and had their terms of indenture extended, John Punch's punishment, the African, is that he's going to be a slave for life. And so this starts to kind of begin some of that codification of what it means to sort of be kind of Black in the Americas. And then of course, for Black women, I think it intensifies with this 1662 statute. This is where they sort of figure out what they're gonna do with enslaved children, particularly those who have white fathers. So for enslaved African women who have been raped by white men, there's some confusion around whether or not their children are actually going to be sort of free based on their racial history. And so this statute sort of makes it plain that the offspring will follow the status of the mother. So if the mother's enslaved, regardless of the father's paternity, the child is going to be, regardless of the father's race, the child will be enslaved. And so this really kind of incentivizes Black women's sort of rape and sexual assault. And just to sort of not kind of beat up on the South, these sorts of policies were taking place in both sort of Southern and Northern colonies. So even in places like Pennsylvania, which, you know, has this sort of Quaker background, and I think certainly has a legacy of abolitionist activism, was also a place where Black women's sort of victimization was codified in law. So for example, they had statutes around rape, and what you see on the slide is the specificity for the punishments if a white woman or a white girl was assaulted, right? There are different sort of punishments for Black men versus white men, and also different punishments if it's sort of an attempted rape of a white woman or girl. And so while we have this level of specificity for assault or attempted assault of a white woman or a white girl, and the varied sort of punishments, whether or not the perpetrator is a Black or white man, that same statute totally omits any discussion about punishment for the rape or attempted rape of a Black woman or Black girl by either a white man or a Black man. So this is just sort of one of these examples where you have the legal system starting to sort of codify and place Black women and Black girls in this really vulnerable sort of position. At the same time that you have some of those advances, right? So these rape laws in the Celia case, actually, I think I'm gonna go forward. No, I'll go back. The Celia case, just to briefly mention it, because I think Dr. Berry already expressed it out. One of the things I want to just highlight about that case is that it's a really important example of how the legal system refused to protect Celia from rape or sexual assault, but she was still subject to its harshest punishment. So she was executed for defending herself against this rape and sexual assault. And that dynamic, the way in which the legal system at the same time, on one hand, makes Black women vulnerable to violence, right? Rape and sexual assault by omitting any protections for them, it doesn't exempt them from its harshest punishments. And that dynamic carries on throughout enslavement and you know, past the Civil War, right up into, I would argue, our present. But accompanying that legal sort of codification are these kind of social, cultural stereotypes. There's a mythology that accompanies that. It says Black women are essentially unrapeable, that we are so libidinous and of such low character that there basically is no virtue to protect, right? These women and girls don't need any rape laws, right? They're all basically very loose women, very hot-natured, what have you. So there's this mythology that emerges. At the same time, you have these caricatures about Black womanhood, right? The mammy, this sort of, you know, fat, asexual, supposedly, right, image, this designed to kind of camouflage white men sexual assault of Black women who work in the homes. You have this sort of Jezebel stereotype, which is, again, this libidinous kind of Black woman. And also one that I encounter is this sort of colored Amazon, this idea about Black women as sort of violent and criminal and predatory. And so this is one of the images that they sort of showed in one of the National Police Gazette, sort of a you know, Black woman as a crazy cook. And one of the things that I'm always struck by with this image is that the Black woman is faceless. She doesn't have any features, right? What that photo conveys, the most significant thing is that she is a Black, right? And she's sort of juxtaposed next to this statue of a Venus de Milo, right, which has all this detail, supposed to be like the, you know, sort of the image of perfect kind of white womanhood and femininity, and to the horror of the white man in the backdrop, right? So these are sort of the images, the rhetoric that emerge around Black womanhood. So the legal system sort of writes us out of protection, but leaves us vulnerable. And then you have this sort of cultural and social sort of, you know, ideologies taking root that basically situate us as lascivious women, violent, debased, totally the antithesis of any femininity. And so those stereotypes, you know, began in enslavement, passed through the Civil War, and even long after, well into the early sort of 20th century. But Black women sort of leaves us especially vulnerable to rape and sexual assault. So at the same time that you have this spate of lynchings that I know most people have heard about in history, the epic lynchings of Black men that occur after enslavement, because now they don't have monetary value, right? When they were enslaved, there's this irony, their body has a monetary value. You couldn't just go and lynch an enslaved person because you would have to compensate their owner. Right, but after, you know, the irony of the ending of enslavement is that it sort of removes some of that. So at the same time that you have Black men being lynched, you also have a number of Black women also being lynched. And a lot of times they meet their end once again trying to guard against rape and sexual assault. And so one of the things that is important for us as historians and scholars is to always try to privilege Black women's own words whenever we find them. So I put up this quote just from this sister in 1904, just to sort of demonstrate the everyday sort of violences and harassment that Black women endured and the trauma that they're subjected to through it, right? That whether she's just trying to go to the store, right? If she's wanting to be in the crowd, if she's looking for a job, there are all these ways that they are pressed upon and vulnerable to sexual harassment. But also there's a real frustration too, because remember, the law left them vulnerable to assault by both Black and white men. And so one of the things that this other quote really expresses again too, is that frustration that in some respects, Black women felt like they were getting it from both ends. You know, on one hand, we've got white men who are able to assault us. On the other hand, we have, you know, the domestic and intimate partner violence from Black men who, you know, we're expecting to be our natural protectors, right? There's this real frustration that emerges from Black women, realizing that on one hand, they want to be free, they want to be autonomous and safe, but are chafing up against sort of the limitations that have been wrought by this legal system and the persistent kind of narratives that are negative about who they are. At the same time, they're also limited economically to some very sort of low income kinds of employment. So even after enslavement, the two areas where Black women are finding most of their employment is either agricultural work, which is usually tenant farming, what people think about as sharecropping. It's hugely exploitative. People are basically, it's like a debt peonage system, or domestic service. And domestic service puts Black women in peril because it makes them really vulnerable to rape and sexual assault in white homes, right? They're going in, and so just that, I think when Dr. Bering talked about the warnings that Black women get around trying to protect themselves and protecting your principle, that holds true even after enslavement. And so young girls get the prep about going into some of these places for service and, you know, carrying hat pins and all these kinds of things to sort of guard themselves in these white homes, because they know that there is no justice for them. Even if they do try to level an accusation of rape, it's sort of summarily dismissed. And more often than not, they may actually incur some sort of punishment or violent retribution from the state on top of it. So all of these kind of dynamics emerge. You got this legal codification, this social sort of rhetoric around Black womanhood, as well as this economic marginalization. It kind of coalesces, and it really puts Black women sort of disproportionately in prisons and penitentiaries. And this is something that begins really almost from the start of the penitentiary, but certainly up through the 19th and early 20th centuries. They're disproportionately represented. I'm a stats person. I'm so sorry. I'm going to subject everyone to these numbers just for a minute. But I want you to just sort of really take a look for a minute from the 1880s up through the 1920s. If you look in the South, you actually see that Black women are more disproportionately represented in prison than Black men. So whereas you have Black men accounting for 72% of all prisoners, male prisoners, Black women account for 86% of all female prisoners in the South, right? And that disproportionate, they're also disproportionately represented in a lot of places in the North, in the Midwest, and on the West Coast as well. So those narratives really harm Black womanhood, right? And it contributes to their disproportionate representation in prisons and penitentiaries. Additionally, they also receive longer sentences than white women for comparable crimes. So the majority of their crimes are nonviolence, larceny offenses, but they serve longer time, but also a number of Black women who go into prisons and penitentiaries for violent offenses. In a lot of cases, they do so defending against domestic violence. They end up incurring assault charges or assault and batteries with intent to kill. So again, this legal system that has sort of situated and placed Black women outside of protection is always there and at the ready to subject them to the harshest punishments, even in those instances when they are defending themselves. The other piece that I want to highlight too is domestic service itself also functions as a kind of, I call it the domestic service to prison pipeline, because there's this great quote in Philadelphia, this Black domestic says that white folks tend to miss what they never had, right? And so there's this way too that Black women are in white homes. If anything goes missing, they are immediately accused. And when white people call the police, who are predominantly also white and brought before white justice, the working class women almost always are convicted. So Black women in places like Philadelphia also have some of the highest rates of conviction of any of the constituents in the city. And so they also do harder time on the inside. Even when there are reformatories that are emerging in the 1920s that are designed to sort of, you know, provide women with like, you know, kind of retraining and, you know, seeing them as redeemable somehow, Black women are usually put outside of that, because whereas white women who end up in the criminal justice system are regarded as sort of having gone astray, Black women's sort of criminality is believed to be inherent to who we are. So they tend to not go to reformatories. They end up going to the more custodial prisons, or in the South, they actually are convict leasing and working, you know, at hard labor right alongside Black men. So I just want to sort of wrap up. I'm talking fast. I know we want to get to discussion, but just to sort of reiterate some of the takeaways for some of these legal legacies of violence and traumas, that again, the legal system really leaves Black women and girls vulnerable to sexual assault. A lot of time, Black women's victimization is eclipsed by these myths around as being sort of immoral, violent, criminal. They're subject to harsh punishments by the same legal system that's placed them outside of protection. And that all of these factors really continue today. So even if we think about present day cases, a perfect example would be the case of Marissa Alexander, who, I don't know if folks recall this case. This was a Black woman who had been battered, who fires the warning shot, right? In the same state where Trayvon Martin, you know, killer, goes, you know, is able to kill him, right, on the argument of stand your ground and walk away. Marissa Alexander, this battered woman with an order of protection, fires a warning shot, is convicted and goes to jail. There's this whole movement to try to free her, but it's a perfect example of that dynamic right up until today, of Black women not being able to get protection from the law, but the moment that they try to defend themselves, becoming victim to some of its harshest punishments, and the role that domestic violence itself also plays in that criminalization. So thank you for your time. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Again, my name is Callie Nicole Gross. This is my website. You can follow me on Twitter, and Dinah already talked about our book, so I will stop and pass the mic now over to either Umi or Dr. Ross.
Well, we thank you very much, Callie, for your presentation as well, and such rich information, and looking at that intersectionality of systems and how that impacted then the health and well-being of Black women over that period of time. And as you said, it wasn't just one system, it was all of the systems coming together to ensure the marginalization of Black women. And so if we add the issue of domestic violence and sexual assault on top of those things, as women today are trying to navigate their way to safety, to well-being, how difficult it still is for them, as they have been seen with that lens that has traveled forth from from freedom, captivity, enslavement, freedom again, and it still exists. And so, yeah, thank you very much for sharing that. Anyone have any questions or remarks that you'd like to follow concerning the whole aspect of historical trauma in Black women's lives? Anyone have any other thing they wanted to add? We don't have any questions from the audience right now. I have been fielding a couple of things, but there aren't any outstanding questions. Anything that you'd like to add? Having none, then I will introduce again then Dr. Keisha Ross. If you would please, thank you for putting your PowerPoint on the screen. And we're going to now transition, because as we've been talking about all of this trauma that has impacted Black women over our histories, over our life course, really, then, and how it's impacted us and our families, then Dr. Keisha Ross has an opportunity to work with individuals in looking at how do we heal from this trauma? What is it that that is necessary for us to do in order for us to heal from the trauma? And yes, Dr. Ross, if you could go for it.
Yes, thank you to Dr. Rainey Bering. She laid out the history for us, and Dr. Gross, she intertwined now how the legal system, how oppression was intertwined within the legal system. So part of what I want to talk about is the impacts of historical trauma and its effect on help-seeking behaviors for Black populations. I am aware of the time, so I'm going to try to get through it to leave us some time for discussion. So, just in general, wanted to define trauma in a general way. A traumatic experience is an event that threatens someone's life, safety, or well-being. So while I know Ujima focuses on, anti-violence against Black women, I'd also want us to recognize that there is a diversity of traumatic experiences, and that can include physical and sexual abuse, intimate partner violence or domestic violence, also community and school violence, which is often underrepresented. When we think about urban trauma in many low-income communities, there's unfortunately a good bit of post-traumatic stress among Black and brown communities. So that's something to keep in mind. Medical trauma, motor vehicles, acts of terrorism, war experiences, cultural experiences that sometimes may be considered inhumane in other cultures, keeping that in mind, suicide, homicides, as well as other traumatic losses. So now that we are thinking about trauma in general, what is trauma? Why does it happen? When we think of fight and flight, this is the body's evolutionary way, the brain, to know, okay, I have to protect myself. So through much research, we've also understood now, we've added freeze to that as well, because there are many individuals who experience trauma and there's a shutdown of the body. And it's important for us to acknowledge that, because oftentimes with sexual assault or domestic violence, a person may shut down. They may not have, the ability to move at that time. And if they can consent, it's still trauma, no less. But sometimes there's an internalization of guilt because there wasn't a fighting. Okay. So just thinking of, these systems are there to keep us safe. But what we have to recognize is that constant exposure to trauma impacts the brain structurally, chemically. There's an imbalance. So, sometimes these changes lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder can include re-experiencing, which may be flashbacks, intrusive thoughts. It could be dissociating, feeling as one is back at the time of the actual trauma. There's also increased arousal, that hypervigilance. It might be exaggerated startle. There's negative cognitions, which are negative thoughts or feelings about what has happened that impacts a person's mood and their ability to function. Okay. So now I want to move more so into historical trauma. So when you saw that list of trauma, oftentimes how we're trained in psychology or social work is that trauma happens to the individual. But the difference with historical trauma is that an individual never has to have been exposed to the trauma itself. So as we heard the history, of slavery being captured, as we think of the modern day today, I may have not experienced that directly. However, we have to realize epigenesis, there is an impact, there's mutation of the genes. As I listened to Dr. Rainey Bering talked about being on the slave ships, and some were pregnant as they came on, or some became pregnant there. Imagine, the terror and the fear that women were experiencing. And that was something that, a fetus was also experiencing as the brain was developing. So we have to realize that we have several generations that were born under this type of stress. Then when we think about breeding camps or grounds, people being forced to procreate. So we understand, this is usually a happy time that we think about, but we have to think about, conception and being born and early development. Being exposed to this type of trauma has impacted the DNA of Black people over time. So this is just a little bit about trauma. If you want to read a little bit more on historical trauma, Maria Braveheart, she did a lot of work looking at the Jewish population, and then she adapted that to the Native American population or First Nations people to recognize, regardless of what help or psychotherapy was being done, there was such an innate level of trauma that they had to try to find a way to explain that. And that was historical trauma. And I love what Dr. Rainey Bering talked about, the soul value. There had to be something within, that indomitable spirit of the ancestors to keep moving, and to be able to enhance one's experience even under that adverse level of trauma and stress. So what we want to recognize in that today, I'll bring it forward to say, okay, how is this impacting us in the here and now? Okay. So as we talked about before, as a collective phenomenon, one never has to have been exposed to the stressor or the trauma themselves. So descendants of slaves are the ones who will be experiencing the historical trauma. So just a little bit on neurobiology, they're doing some work now looking at genetics, and they're found in mouse pups. They were looking at the offspring's generation, and they were able to recognize that even though the offspring were not exposed to the trauma itself, certain smells were bringing about some kind of response in the offspring. So showing that there is this genetic link, and more work is being done on that. So that's something you can look up with Dr. Carrie Ressler, who's at Emory. So who is impacted by historical trauma? So many communities, Blacks, African Americans, Africans, so people of color from all the diasporas, American Indians or First Nations peoples, Asian Pacific Islanders, immigrants, the Latinx community, as well as families living in poverty. For today, I will focus more so on the Black population, but recognizing that historical trauma has happened for many communities. And unfortunately, colonialization, white supremacy, this level of oppression has happened for many groups of people. So part of what's important to recognize in terms of before we get to the help-seeking behaviors is, how does historical trauma manifest itself. And something that's important to recognize is the internalization of oppression. So being subjugated for a long time, being oppressed, hearing negative views about oneself, unfortunately, sometimes that message is taken in and people start to accept that message and they start to believe that view, and it forms a core belief that is negative. So sometimes we find anger, hatred, aggression is being inflicted on members of one's own community. So there's intergroup racial issues, which may be in-group and out-group, but then we have racial issues as well, meaning within the Black community, there's a great deal of issues. And, we can go back to thinking of, breaking the curse of Willie Lynch, divide and conquer, putting old against the young, the light against the dark. We have to think about colorism too, also within the community, one's hue or complexion, all of that impacts self-esteem. So these are issues that are still going on today. So when you think of contemporary implications of the transatlantic slave trade, people will say, well, why are we talking about this? Slavery ended so long ago, but it ended, but it didn't end, right? Because it modernized. So we have to realize that this internal oppression also leads to the depression, the anxiety, sometimes post-traumatic stress or post-traumatic slave syndrome, which I'll talk a bit more in a few. So I don't have to go into detail with this because it was laid out very well just in terms of the history. But current manifestations, I want us to think about what's happening now. Mistrust of the police. This is large as we thinking going back to slavery. When did policing start? Policing overseeing the runaway slaves, trying to keep people in line. So there's a history of Black people being over policed. So what we're seeing today is just a current modern manifestation of something that historically has happened. So, when I do my minority stress resilience group and recognizing that hearing this, seeing this on television, it becomes triggers for individuals. And we have to realize that even though it's not happening to the person themselves, to see that on the news, a Trayvon Martin or Eric Garner, all of that impacts people where there isn't this level of detachment because we see ourselves in these people and we recognize that it impacts our full community. So part of what I talked about earlier too also was intergenerational trauma being manifested in poverty. So we have to recognize that having low economic means also is something that contributes to historical trauma, because when we think about slavery, we think of intergenerational wealth. That is something that was not able to be passed on to each generation. So we see a great bit of urban trauma now, unfortunately, in low income areas because not having the equal level of resources. Part of also what happens today is that there's the more subtle or covert racism that happens in terms of microaggressions. And that's where people, on day-to-day experience some kind of hassles. It can be comments that, other people may not recognize. So sometimes it may be that, oh, you speak so well. Or, that's so intelligent. Or people come in and they may see me in the office and don't have the expectation of me being the psychologist. So sometimes, unfortunately, it's that implicit bias, these unconscious ideas that we've been told. And when we look at the laws, it carries over till now in common times. So we see that what has happened in history is impacting us today. So now I want to move into help-seeking behaviors. There's a significant mistrust sometimes with medical as well as mental health. And part of that is we have to think of our history. Most times we will think of Tuskegee because it is the most modernized that we are aware of. But we also have to think about, as we're talking about women, that gynecology and obstetrics was advanced working on African slave women who weren't given any type of ether. And once everything was, perfected, all of these type of treatments and procedures now were given to white women who were given ether. So we have to recognize that there is a history too also of medical atrocities. And a good reference for that is Harriet Washington's medical apartheid. the experimentation on Black Americans from colonial times to the present. So that gives a great history, not just of the Tuskegees, which have been popularized, but all of the dirty little secrets that we aren't taught through history. So what does this do? That's not that long ago. Many people were alive at that time. You know, even if they weren't alive, again, we are descendants of people who have had this experience. So now it creates this level of sometimes mistrust. Some people might even, in my profession, see it as paranoia. So sometimes we have to recognize that these are adaptive, healthy type of behaviors, because over time, again, we learn that we need to keep ourselves safe. So that's where cultural competent training comes in terms of when we're working with people of color. We have to understand, well, how much of this is exposure, you know, what they've experienced, how much of this is a defense mechanism, how much of this is protecting themselves versus a psychosis, a thought disorder. So reasons for fear, we've talked about a great bit of this, so I won't go into detail, but again, stolen property, dehumanization, mass incarceration, torture, race riots, police brutality, mass murder. So all of this leading up to what I discussed earlier, post-traumatic disorder for individuals who have been exposed to any of these type of traumas. But then on top of it, we have to recognize that being from the Black population with the history of enslavement, that now compounds it, because there can be individual trauma that is now compounded by historical trauma. And also navigating the system can be difficult in terms of feeling that one has someone that they can trust to work with. So post-traumatic slave syndrome, I definitely recommend this read. Dr. Joy DeGruy, she's a PhD in social work. She's done a lot of work, you know, over several decades working with people of color, and just looking at those areas and the themes that carry over within the community. And a great deal of what she does is explain the behaviors that we see in the community, which were often adaptive behaviors to keep us safe. You know, as the other panelists talked about, you know, fear of Black women coming towards puberty, because again, they're becoming women now and having to protect themselves from the slave master. You know, sometimes there was also that spoiling behavior. She talks about it in her book. You know, Massa may come around and he's looking, you know, at the young girl and the spoiling of her as a person, because she didn't want the child to be looked at as this sexual object. So we have to recognize these things have happened in history, and unfortunately sometimes some of that may carry on into current day when we look at in the community, again, as we talked about the challenges that we have amongst ourselves, not only interacting with, you know, systemic racism or individualized racism, but dealing with it within our own community. So recognizing that because of what we have been told, these myths of us being inferior, that has been taken in within us. We've been miseducated in a way to have a negative view of ourselves. So the work that I do with individuals is oftentimes building, you know, a healthy racial and cultural identity, working on ways to manage anxiety and stress, and constantly being in a system where one isn't viewed, the value of our life isn't viewed the same. You know, oftentimes when I do trainings, you know, there are many people who don't understand, well, why is there a Black Lives Matter movement? Why isn't all lives? And I'm sure we hear this, you know, on so many platforms, and it is because, as you've laid out, history has shown that Black lives don't matter. So we have to educate people now to understand why, what's happening in our community, and that our life has value. So I definitely recommend this. This is just a brief talking about multi-generational trauma together with oppression leads to absence of opportunity to heal or access benefits. So as I talked about before, being in areas where there's a lack of resources, there's not enough providers, then there's not providers of color, which I'll talk about later, because oftentimes there is a mistrust in the community that someone who isn't from the Black community may not understand their experience, leads to post-traumatic slave syndrome. So I'm moving through a little bit quick because I'm looking at time now. So this is just some of the symptoms of historical trauma. So depression, anxiety, shame, fear and distrust, loss of concentration. Unfortunately, sometimes it becomes substance abuse. It becomes violence. We see there's a lot of intergenerational violence because if we don't recognize other skills in terms of conflict resolution, unfortunately, violence becomes the answer. And we have to recognize that as a people, there has been several generations of exposure to violence and how that has impacted us physiologically, how it has impacted us when we think about social learning, meaning if it's not genes in nature, we have to recognize that there's nurture in terms of what we have been exposed to. So just talking, this is a bit more of the PTSS, but I don't think we're going to have as much time to go into that because I definitely want us to get through some other areas, but just recognizing vacant esteem, oftentimes leading to depression. So, you know, Marcus Garvey said that, you know, a people without a culture is like a tree without roots. So we have to understand that being disconnected from our roots has also, you know, caused some level of emptiness, and that emptiness becomes hopelessness. It becomes depression. It becomes the anxiety and sometimes the substance use. Also, looking at the high bit of violence that we talked about, anger and violence, which sometimes is understood. There's sometimes this righteous level of anger because of being exposed to so much. However, it's not in the absence of having an adaptive way to channel some of that. This is where we see sometimes it becomes self-harm, it becomes suicide, it becomes homicide. So it's definitely, we need a space to heal for this, which is a part of the minority stress resilience groups that I work on. Also, just talking about learned helplessness, you know, after one has been in the system for long periods of time and, you know, being rejected, being told no, sometimes people, they give up, they lack the energy to move forward. So just being aware of that. This is just a bit of health disparities. I'm not going to read slides, but bottom line is recognizing that Black people are at higher risk of medical issues as well as mental health issues. And part of that is recognizing the constant exposure to chronic stress. So now there's a great deal of research on race-based stress that shows that the amount of hormones that are released, you know, there's the cortisol, there it is. When we think about the pituitary gland, everything that is released for people who are at a higher level of stress, what happens over time is that it weakens the immune system. So it puts us at greater risk of, you know, the cancers, you know, becoming depressed, anxious. So it's not just what we thought in terms of, you know, a mental health issue, meaning being emotional. We recognize that there's a physiological impact of being under this level of stress. So part of what we talked about earlier in help-seeking behavior is this lack of trust. You know, studies have been done. It isn't always that we seek help less. There are a great deal of the Black community that seeks help, but what happens is we have a higher attrition rate, that oftentimes we stop psychotherapy earlier than our counterparts. And a great part of that is, again, the stereotypes that exist within society, the negative images that we are fed in the media of Black people, as we saw the picture earlier with the Black woman, the cook. There's so many negative images out there. Sometimes there's a level of shame, a level of embarrassment or guilt among Black people, so they don't want to seek help in fear of that they would be misunderstood. And unfortunately, at times that happens. So now it becomes invalidation that, you know, people don't understand their experience. Also, we have to think about culturally, it became protective for us, some of our views of not seeking help outside of the home as a protective measure. So cultural sensitivity definitely becomes something that is important. As we talked about the stereotypes, many people often have a stopping of therapy due to that. However, we do know with research, we don't have enough people of color, unfortunately, as treatment providers, but through cultural humility and cultural competence training and continued work on that, we see that we can lower some of that attrition, because working on implicit bias, working on diminishing those stereotypes, it helps to provide a greater level of care. And we do see that more people will continue based on that. So cultural beliefs, this idea that, we're strong, look at all that we have experienced over time, we're a strong people, and all of these things are true, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that we don't need to seek help at times. But oftentimes spirituality and religion has been a way of coping for people. As we think about the soul value that Dr. Rainey Bering was talking about, that is there, but sometimes we can end up, sanctified in suffering, meaning pushing all of that down, pushing all of the individual trauma, the historical trauma down, because we don't want to be perceived as weak. So I do a great bit of work in the faith community as well, helping to educate ministers, pastors, other faith leaders to understand signs and symptoms of mental illness. And in the work I do, I incorporate spirituality and religion. So if religious coping is something that is important for an individual, it is used within session, and not necessarily in terms of like prayer in session, but a matter of having that supportive system, and that is encouraged, because research shows that if you incorporate those cultural beliefs, people are have a greater chance of improving their mental and physical health. So over time, spirituality and religious involvement, as we've talked about, it has been a big part of having value for oneself, thinking about strong kinships, bonds, role flexibility. You find this within, the Black community, sometimes more of the egalitarian type of background, as feminism, was taking hold. Sometimes what the white counterparts were moving towards in terms of being in the workforce, that was already existing for many Black women, because our history has been different. So keeping that in mind, that there can be role flexibility. Also, communalism, the idea of being connected, being more than a brother's keeper, but being a brother and sister's keeper in that way, and that what one does doesn't impact just the individual, but impacts the full community. Also keeping in mind, I have a lot of color in here, just looking at rich affectivity. My family's from the Caribbean, from British Guyana, so just keeping in mind that culture sometimes is expression through one's hair, how one dresses, and keeping in mind that those are things that always aren't accepted in terms of the majority culture. So when I work with individuals from different backgrounds, it becomes very important to reinforce and create a safe space for individuals to express themselves. Also, just the keeping it real which is authenticity. Oftentimes working with individuals from the Black population, they are very skilled and adept at understanding and reading through, if people care, if people are invested. Also just working in terms of trauma, people being exposed to trauma, throughout most of their life, they become sensitive, and they understand when people, are being genuine or authentic. So just keeping in mind that yes, terrible things have happened, but the concern becomes, are there only negative impacts of trauma? And thankfully not. So we have to think about resilience. We have to think about post-traumatic growth. So although there's post-traumatic disorder, which we all often focus on, positive psychology looks at, strengths. So in terms of when I work with individuals, I also work on a resilience plan. I don't only look at, deficits or things that are wrong. I don't come from a stance of that people are broken or that they need to be fixed. It's more so enhancing a person's experience. Looking at adaptive survival behaviors, evolutionary enhancements, the fact that, as a people, there is still growth despite all that has happened and is still happening in current times. As we think about mass incarcerations, as we think about police shootings, we think about domestic violence, and there not being as much of a platform for women with that. We often hear about the police shootings for Black men, but we don't hear about it as often for Black women. So just making sure that we continue to be a voice, that there is the resilience factor with that, and that helps people to heal. So how do we enhance quality of life despite the historical trauma? One, confronting it, as we were asked earlier in terms of the images, it's important to see the images, because again, if we don't confront it, we cannot accept what has happened and find a way to work through it. Working on understanding historical trauma, that could be through research, through study. You've been given resources today, great books from the speakers that you can use as well, and focus on healing of oneself. It always has to start internally, and then that becomes a platform for healing, you know, within families as well as in community. So what are some of the ways this can happen? Spiritual, religious, or cultural services. Part of this can be challenging, you know, misguided beliefs. We have to recognize that, you know, religion also was used in terms of colonialization, and this does not mean that anyone has to be anti-religion, but we have to recognize the way in which it was used, unfortunately, was to keep people oppressed. So coming more from a liberation theology helps people to realize they can be empowered. Psychological treatment, sometimes that may mean psychological testing, psychotherapy, which can be individual therapy, family therapy, couples therapy. Psychiatric therapy, meaning medicine at times, which also in the Black population is not easy, but I do a lot of psychoeducation because of what has happened. There is that level of mistrust, but sometimes medicine is needed. Social justice and advocacy, keeping in mind leadership, being volunteering, being members of boards, being members of organizations that are anti-violence, anti-racist, or, you know, developing one's own organizations. It also includes education and knowledge of self. So being able to dispel, you know, the negative myths that we have been taught that we are inferior. And I love the way Dr. Rainey Bering started to say that, you know, we were free, meaning that history doesn't start with slavery. So we also have to go back to understand where we have come from, and understanding the resilience that we have in us, as well as the indomitable spirit of the ancestor to continue to move us forward. Okay. I'm sorry, I went backwards. All right, so I sped through that a bit so we could have some time for some questions, and that is my contact information there. At the beginning, I did mention I'm at the St. Louis VA. However, in terms of my trainings, that is done through New Horizons Psychological Services. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ross, for sharing that dynamic presentation as well, and leading us into the full circle, and coming from, you know, how we got into this position to some ways in which we can help to heal ourselves and to overcome some of the dynamics of what's happened to us over our life course, intergenerationally and historically. We did have a question from someone, and they wanted to know more specifically, you know, for organizations, for nonprofit organizations, for educational organizations, how can they integrate these lessons that you've given us, all three of you have given us today, into healing for or working with their Black communities in their locations? You know, do you have some suggestions on what that would look like? How would we do that? What kinds of things can we utilize to do that?
I'll start off briefly. I think is to know the history behind it. I think some of the community service providers should understand, which is one of the reasons why I think Dr. Gross and I were happy to participate in this panel, to understand that there's a foundation to this history, I mean, a foundation to the experiences, but also like what kinds of things did people do over time to fight back and to resist. And I think there are, Dr. Ross shared at the very end, I think the last couple of slides are, you know, how do we move forward? I was thinking that as we were sitting here, you know, I want to make sure that what we offer in this webinar are solutions and not just us, you know, beating a dead horse over the problems. For me, I think it's important that once we learn this history, there can be an empowerment factor. For me, you know, to study slavery is not something that actually depresses me. It's actually something that uplifts me, because I see the strength and the survival mechanism of people who made it here so that I could be here today. So there are spaces for me that I can tap into. And I would say that first is just so that making sure service providers understand the larger history, and then thinking about that, how cultural aspects of this history will help them understand treatment programs. And I would turn that over to somebody else that has that expertise.
I agree with that. And one thing I just want to share, if you're shopping for a therapist, meaning this is something that you know, as you meet with someone, you can ask them these type of questions like, what do you understand about the history, you know, of Black people, whether it's in America or other diasporas, you know, challenging them to talk about race in the room. How is that experience going to be different when there isn't a matching in race? Also, you can go to places like blacktherapist.org that gives a list of African American and Black therapists. Also, the Association of Black Psychologists is a national organization, and they typically have local chapters in most states. If they don't have one within the state, they have it regionally, like Midwest or South. And they do emotional emancipation circles, which are basically a safe space for healing. So those are things that also can be done in addition to like learning your history, being empowered in that way. If it's going to be a treatment based, those are places that you can seek treatment.
I just want to add that I mean, like everyone has said, it's the scholarship that we do is designed to sort of help and empower. And so one of the hopes that I have for talking about this legal history is that it can help folks who are engaged in supporting women who are in the criminal justice system, women who are victims of intimate partner violence, to realize even, you know, if it can help to be a part of folks' defense, if it can help when thinking about jury selection, that there are all kinds of ways that Black women are systematically and structurally disadvantaged when they go before the justice system or have to interact with the justice system in any way, in terms of protection, but also in terms of defending themselves when they get charged for self-defense because they don't have access to the legal system. So those are just some of the hopes that I have, but also one of the things that excited me about participating was I also want to be in conversation with other folks who are engaging with folks currently, so that we can also sort of brainstorm together and think about more ways that we can help make this history accessible and applicable, so that it's knowledge, but also action items for folks, how we continue to go forward and continue to resist.
Well, I want to assure you, Dr. Gross, that now that we have found you, that you are in the list and you will be used. And so we will be calling on all of you to ensure that we're able to take this knowledge and take it to the community. UGMA is also going to have another webinar in the future. I'm not sure what month, but in the future we have planned another webinar where we're looking at culturally specific services to the Black community. And so we will identify some very specific programs that are happening right now and are using this history, using the lessons from our history to integrate it into service provision. And so we'll keep you aware and apprised of all of those things as well. And I'm going to try to get in one more question. We're running out of time, but we've noticed that we've had a lot of people or more people who are coming to us and having members of the community, particularly the mainstream community, and saying to them that Black folk just need to get over slavery. We just need to get over this racism, and that slavery was a long time ago, and that it wasn't the current mainstream population that should be held accountable for this. And things are not just as bad as they used to be. And so how do we as a community respond? I mean, you know, it's like people get slapped with that and they're like, what? Wait a minute. And, but they, you know, there's a need for us to be able to come back and say, this is why we need to understand this, and this is why we are where we are. Can you respond to that?
I often hear that when I give trainings on historical trauma, and I often say history did not end. It morphed. Even though we had the Emancipation Proclamation, we saw many other laws come into play then that impacted people, and we see the disparities today. So the contemporary piece of it is mass incarceration. We see it as systemic racism. So really teaching people the difference between individual ideal and thoughts versus systemic racism, meaning structural racism, where it is intertwined within the laws, and that the laws create these disparities, whether it be legal disparities, whether it be mental health or medical disparities, whether it's education or unemployment or housing. These are the areas that we see all of modern racism, systemic racism manifesting itself?
I also respond by saying, I also think my pushback answer to that is also that I want a lot of these mainstream folks to also let go of white supremacy. That I think that they also need to really address those issues. And so when we talk about, you know, the experiences of Black women in this country and with violence, it's also to shed a light on that, that the same way that we have these issues around violence sort of, you know, pass, you know, having the potential to pass through generationally, I also think it's worth just sort of noting too, just, you know, place mark somewhere, that that has also impacted the white community in a variety of ways too, that there's a level of violence and pathology, particularly among people who have this, you know, these white supremacist ideas that also need to be addressed, and that they should be seeking some treatment for as well. So those are some of my answers back, is that we need to understand too that violence is not only impacting to the Black community, that there's a lot of, you know, violence now among these mainstream communities, and unfortunately white supremacy usually excuses it.
Right. We have run out of time. We did have a question that was about batterers, so or people who batter. And so how do we look at that from this historical context, that we're talking about what was done to our community and the making of someone who has anger, the making of someone who carries with them that violent situation. But this is a Black man now perpetuating violence against Black women. So I know we're out of time. If you want to quickly respond, you know, just if one person wants to quickly respond, then we can go ahead and sign off. Anyone want to handle that?
So I'm trying to think of a way to do it quickly. But, okay, Dr. Ross is unmuted, so if you got a quick one, go for it.
Well, I just want to say quickly, part of what happens is, yes, understanding historical context. We can only, you know, heal once we know and understand the underpinnings of where some of this comes from. So yes, understanding history, but then also having to work in terms of healing, which means building a healthy, positive aspect and belief about oneself. We have to realize that these negative images are so ingrained within our community that it's unconscious, and it's recognizing that those unconscious beliefs impact people's behavior. So in the minority stress resilience group, the focus is empowerment. It's empowerment based. So while history, what has happened, can seem heavy, we have to look at and own it in the sense of there is that positive aspect of our history in terms of where we are resilient. You know, we do have the ability to heal. We have the ability to move forward. So part of that is also recognizing that we have to dispel the images that we've been given about ourselves and learning to build more positive, you know, core beliefs. So that may include psychotherapy, it may include treatment, it may include advocacy, meaning being able to do more within one's community, but that it's on multi-levels. There's no one way to, you know, say this can be addressed. We have to address it in terms of the mind, the body, and the spirit.
Thank you for that. And we really, again, appreciate all three of you, Dr. Rainey Bering, Dr. Ross, Dr. Gross, for participating with us today. We'd also like to say thank you to our interpreters who have participated the whole time. We definitely appreciate you being able to help us give access to the entire community to participate in this forum. We will post this webinar on UGIMA's website, ugimacommunity.org, and so you will be able to go there and replay it after we edit and get it prepared for posting. So it will be there within a couple of weeks. I'm not going to say time. I don't know when it'll be there. It'll be there soon. Sometimes I make them up, so I don't want to do that. So, you know, but we will post that. We will also be sending out an evaluation for everyone. We would greatly appreciate it if you would complete the evaluation for us. And again, feel free to contact UGIMA for continued technical assistance and training and services and working with the Black community. Hope to see you in July for our webinar that will take place then, and have a great day. Take care. On behalf of UGMA, the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community, have a great day. Goodbye.
Thank you.